particular story, what is it normally called? What do people call this particular story? The prodigal son, exactly. Prodigal son. Today we're going to not think about it in that terms, because I think it is about far more than just the son. And I realize there's a lot made about the son and pictures of salvation and a person going to taking their portion of an inheritance and going and wasting it and realizing that, oh, I've messed up, and come back and having the relationship restored. So we're going to turn it on its head this time and not think so much about the son, but we're going to think about the father. We're going to think about the father. So we're going to think about this from the father's heart perspective. So we're going to call this particular portion Father's Heart. We'll come to this in just a second. As you're looking at that, about 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago now, All Saints High School, I was down on the road up to do an assembly, and like all schools have been doing for the last year and a half now, it's all been video, which is a bit difficult, but you get used to it, and that's the way it works now. And they want it to be about Father's Day, which is always challenging for me because of my own situation. As most of you know, my father did a runner, as I shared last week, when I was 10, and was not involved in our life. And I shared this on the video. And I talked about, on the short little 8 or 10 minute video, that, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago this morning, that the scripture says that God is a father to the fatherless. And this was an incredible revelation to me when I was a teenager and just started to go to church. Well, a week later, after I submitted that video, I was out in my garden trying to pull those weeds out of the strawberry patch, which is a forever task, by the way. So if you ever have strawberries, understand that the weeds just grow far better than the strawberries do, and maybe that's just life in general. But trying to get those weeds out of that strawberry patch was incredibly tough. I was there bent over, and come to find out that there was 2 or 3 young people walking down the street. And as often they'll do, they'll recognize me most of the time from infant or junior school, sometimes from high school, but when you get to high school, it's very uncool to recognize the vicar, right? Or if you do say something, as they said, Pastor Eric or something, straight away I was thinking to myself, okay, here we go. What's going to be thrown in my direction? And they said, one young lad said, I saw your video in assembly. And I said, okay. And I didn't turn around. I should have. And as they were walking by, he made the comment, I'm sorry about your father. Now this was a teenager, probably 13 years old, with 2 or 3 of his friends, who could have easily taken the mick out of him for what he said. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine that? Showing compassion on somebody because of their situation. Well, I just took that little thing and just put it up on the Rosington Forum Facebook page. Couldn't believe the response. There were 350 responses to that little comment. I don't think I've put up anything ever, including the Methodist Church situation, that got that kind of response. And it got me thinking, what is this thing about a father or about an absentee father that stirs up so much emotion within people? And I think that for whatever reason, people want to connect with their dad, but maybe struggle. Because I do know that as a man, as men, I'm not trying to paint with a broad brush here, but I think blokes struggle with emotional connection far more than women do. Now, I'm not a woman, so I don't understand it from a woman's perspective, but I know from a bloke, I think I struggle with emotional connection. I have to work at it far more than women do. And maybe there's a whole bunch of people out there who are hungering for this connection with their father, and it's just not there. And maybe that's why that particular comment raised up so much in the way of response. Now, if you take a look at this little image that I have up here, it's very, very telling, isn't it? With the title, Facts About the Fatherless. I realize this is in the United States, but far more statistics that I can find are from the States. Sadly, I found very, very little from the United Kingdom, from the UK, but I would say it's not too far different here than it is there. It says the United States, nearly 24 million children live absent from their biological fathers. Fatherless children represent, notice what happens, all of these situations, when the father's absent, either physically, like I said, mentally, psychologically, from the family situation. 63% of teen suicide, 70% of juveniles in state institutions, youth offending type situations. 71 leave high school, 71%. 75% in chemical abuse centers, drug rehab. 80% of them are rapists. 80% of the rapists had no father in the house. Youth in prison, 85%. 90% of homeless and runaway children have an absentee father. If there's anything that presents the picture of a needed dad, that certainly is it. So we want to take just a few minutes today as we look at what we're going to call a father's heart. A father's heart. In this passage that we've just got done reading in Luke chapter 15, we're well familiar with the story. But as I said, we're going to turn on its head just a little bit. And this applies to certainly every dad that's here, every dad that may be watching, and for all those who is acting as dad. And one of the comments that came out in this response from what this young lad said, this woman was a bit upset, and she said, I think it's not right that schools should have assemblies about fathers and Father's Day, because not everyone is in that situation and has a father. And I responded back and I said, you're right, I totally understand. But also I don't think it's good that we should not recognize fathers, because how it is important. But I did emphasize on the little video that there are loads of mothers, uncles, grandpas, friends, even big brothers or big sisters who act as father, and that's important as well. In this beginning section, in verses 11 through 16, we're going to divide this up into three sections today, and we're just going to kind of buzz through this. And I got something that I want to share with a number of folks today, right at the end of the service. But if you have your papers to follow along, the first little section is going to be from verses 11 through 16, and we're going to call this Tough Days in Dadsville. Eric, where is Dadsville? Well, it's all over the world, okay? Dadsville. There's some tough times going on here. Here it is. His younger son, Luke 15, here we go. His younger son, Jesus told the story. A certain man had two sons. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion that falls to me. So he's talking about his inheritance, by the way. And not many days after, the younger son gathered everything, went to a far country, and wasted his possessions with prodigal, wild living. Does that surprise you, by the way? No, doesn't surprise you. Doesn't surprise you. When he spent all there arose a severe famine in the land, and he began to be in want. He went and joined himself to a citizen and said, who sent him into the fields to feed swine. By the way, for a Jew to feed swine, there's no lower job than that. Because for the Jew, swine was an unclean animal. Terrible, terrible, terrible situation. In verse 16, he would gladly have filled his stomach with the pods that the swine ate, but no one gave him anything. It says that he would have gladly have eaten what the swine ate, but no one gave him anything. Well, here's the situation. There are tough days for this father. As his son comes to him and says, listen, Dad, I'm fed up with living here. I don't like living in this house anymore. Now, we're not told the reason why he said this, but there is something going off. Maybe there is some family strife. Maybe there's some problems going on. Maybe the son thought, you know what? My friends have it so good, I just want to get out of here. Okay? Now, I realize we could go around the room and probably you've had something similar to that in your own family that has come up with your children. Maybe you even did it as a child as well. How many of us ever thought, growing up, that I want to get out of here? It's not fair what Dad or Mom are asking me to do, and I just want to get out of here. Okay? I'm not going to ask for hands, but probably some of us or all of us may have been in that situation. And that's what was happening with this young lad. Certainly, he was being disrespectful. Certainly. This would have been an inheritance. And what's the point of an inheritance? An inheritance was designed to be able to provide something for the children after the parents had passed away. But the young son was being pretty cheeky. And he said, Dad, I don't want to wait till you kick it. I want my money right now. What would you do if you were in that situation? If you were the father, what would you do? Why did he do it? And I often thought to myself, if I was in that situation and my son came up to me demanding that I gave him what he thought was rightly due him, would I have done it? Would I have done it? I would say I probably wouldn't have. But this dad, to illustrate what Jesus wanted to share, did. Now here's the thing. Children need difficulties to learn. Children need difficulties to learn. We all need difficulties to learn. We've all said that we've learned so much in the valley of discouragement. We've learned so much more when times were tough than when everything was going smoothly. I was just chatting with Doreen not too long ago, and by the way, if there's someone you need to pray for, please pray for her and her family. Goodness, they have had more things come along their way in this last 18 months, a year maybe, Doreen? How long? This last year, than I think I've ever seen anyone. Okay? It's been one medical thing after another, one trial, one difficulty after another, in all different sorts of fashion. And it does seem like when it rains, it storms. But one thing she mentioned, and she said that God's grace has come to her in a much more powerful way because of all these difficulties. And it's just the way it is. It's just the way it is. And I hope that regardless of what you're experiencing right now or what you've experienced in these last number of months or going to experience, that God's grace will come in an incredibly strong way and lift you up and bring you through those tough, tough times. The reality is that constantly rescuing our kids from the difficulties that are out there, constantly rescuing, and this is what we can do as parents. And I can understand it. We don't like seeing our children hurting. We don't like seeing them going through difficult times, but sometimes the most loving thing could be is to let them suffer for a period of time so that they can learn. Whether the dad had an insight into what this lad was going to do, I don't know. But this is a parable that Jesus gave for a reason, for a purpose, and it's going to unfold right in front of our eyes. But this father did provide that money that the young lad asked for. He did give it to him, and then the story unfolds. Because here's the reality. Here's the reality when it comes to other kids. Children do not come with a money-back guarantee. Okay? Is this true? This is true. This is true. I know as a parent, as a dad, we wish we could write their story for them. Right? I know you do. You wish you could say, here's what I want to see happen for the next 50 or 60 or 70 years. Trust me, I've been there. And I've had these experiences. And if you'll just do this, and if you'll just avoid these kind of people, and if you'll just get friends with these kind of people, and then if you approach your education this way, and if you think about things this way, then everything's going to be smooth. And I know, as parents, we very much would love to write their scripts. But the reality is, your mom and dad did not write your script. Neither did mine. I had to write my own script. And as a dad, as a parent, our job is to be there when and if everything falls to pot. And quite often, it does. And you know what? Isn't that a great picture of who our Heavenly Father is? When our lives fall to pot, God is there, and He loves us, and He picks us up. And probably there's no better picture of that when dear old Peter is in that boat, out of that water, and Jesus calls him to come out of that boat to walk on the water to him. Peter does it. A lot we can get into on that, but we're not going to. Peter starts walking on that water to Jesus, and all of a sudden he got his eyes off of Jesus onto the wind and the waves and all that, and he started to sink. And then probably one of the briefest prayers in the entire Bible, in English, is only 3 words. You know what the 3 words were? Lord, save me. And Jesus reached out his hand and picked him up out of the mess that he was in. And our Father is good at that. Young people have to make choices. And as a dad, as parents, as mothers, sometimes we can heap so much guilt on ourselves because of the choices our children make. We say or we think in our minds that it's our fault that they chose this, or it's our fault that they chose this path in life because I was an influence on them. Well, there may be some truth to that. But you know what? At the end of the day, young people make their own choices. Okay? You made your own choices. And I think one of the tragedies of modern living, 21st century living, is that we're so quick to blame everybody and everything else for our situations. And if we can get people to take on board responsibilities for our own choices, our own ways of living, then I think not only are things going to be better, that we'll have much better mental health, we'll get past this whole blame game thing, and then things will be moving in the right direction. And I've talked to so many parents who are so distraught because of maybe the direction their children have gone, and they're saying and they're thinking that we play all these kind of mind games. Oh, if I would have only done this. Only if I would not have moved here. If only I'd not have taken this job. Or if only if I'd not have done this, then everything would have been better. Well, first of all, we don't know that. Okay? We don't know that. We don't know that you moving to Lancashire would have made any difference. We don't know. We don't know that whether your son or your daughter had, if they would have not have taken this particular course, they would have found different friends than they found on them. We don't know all those things. So we have to be very careful about heaping all kinds of guilt on ourselves. False guilt, can I say? False guilt. But our job, dads and moms, our job is to right now, regardless of what it was in the past, regardless of the mistakes that we've made, regardless of the mistakes that I've made, right now, my job is to be an example. Okay? I can't change what I've done in the past. That's a done deal. Now, I can, if I need to ask forgiveness of my children for something, then I should do that. Okay? But right now, I can choose today and from now forward what I do. I can choose to be what kind of example that I want to be. Am I a godly example to my children? You may say, Eric, they're grown up, they're moved out of the house, but I guarantee you, they're still watching. They're still watching. So we need to be an example in word, even more so in action. Because we all know that actions speak louder than... There we go. Yep. Actions. Do you believe that? Do you really believe that? Actions, yeah, they do, yeah. Actions speak louder than words. Never say, and I've heard people joke about this, never say, don't do as I do as I say. Does that work as being a parent? Nope. It does not work. They will do what you do. Almost never do what you say, okay? And we need to pray. We need to pray for our children. And we need to be willing to listen. Dads, and I find this one of the toughest jobs. As a dad, and probably with my engineering hat on, I've always been a fixer-up person. I've always been a fixer. That's my mode in life. That's my job in life, to fix everything that I see. And when I see my children broken, what do I want to do? I want to fix them. That's right. That's what I want to do. I want to fix them. But sometimes they don't want to be fixed in the way that I want to fix them. They just need a dad who's willing to listen without having this running all the time. For a dad just to be willing to sit down and let them pour their heart out in whatever way that they want to pour their heart out, just to know that I am there to listen. And I can imagine, as that dad is there, that son coming up to him and said, Dad, I want my money. I'm sure it's very easy to get into this mode of, oh, you know what, I just really wish this time in his life would just go away. We could just fast forward this time. Because we can be so quick to wish the time away. I remember when a certain third child of ours was a baby. And I never believed this thing about colic. You've heard about colic, right? Colic. I thought it was all just some kind of a garbage, just something that's not true. I thought it was just made up in people's minds to make excuses for something until this third child, which shall be unnamed. And this, as he was a baby, we were up virtually every night, all night, back and forth in the bedroom, back and forth. And it got to the point where my eyes were drooping. I'm thinking, I'm going to fall down here. And Lisa and I would take turns, back and forth, trying to calm him, trying to figure out what was going on, and nothing worked. And it wasn't until after weeks and weeks and weeks of going through this, and my mind was thinking, will this ever stop? And it did. And then the months rolled on, the years rolled on, and all of a sudden, they're grown up. And you think, where did all the time go? Where did it go? And one of the mistakes that I made was wishing the time away. Oh, I wish we could get through this preteen stuff. All the hormones sloshing about and and all the upset and all the words and all the anger and all that sort of, I wish this would go away. But here's what I found out. Each stage has its own little challenges and its own little blessings. The 2-year-old stage of, terrible 2s, right? I don't know if it's the terrible. I think we've had more trouble with 3s than 2s. Okay? But even at that, isn't it amazing the number of things that they pick up and learn at such a fast rate in those times? And by the time they get 2s and 3s, and they're growing and they're discovering things. And because of that, they get into bother. And they are starting to stretch their wings a bit and establish their own independence. And because they want their own independence, is when they start to fuss and fume and all those kinds of things. We have to be careful about wishing the time away. There's a song that has become one of my favorite songs, thinking about dads and so forth. It's a song called Cinderella by a chappie called Stephen Curtis Chapman. And it's a song that takes the story of Cinderella, the Disney story of Cinderella, and this girl comes up to her dad at various stages of her life, and she wants him to teach her how to dance, or to dance with him. And he says, I'm so busy, I don't have time for this, and then before he knows it, time is gone, and she's grown up. Now, the story behind the story is that Stephen Curtis Chapman and his wife adopted, I believe it was 2 little girls from China. And they were one time outside playing. And his son, who was a teenager by that time, had just gotten his driving license and was in a hurry to get to some appointment. He jumped in his truck that he had, pulled out of the driveway, not realizing that one of the little girls was behind the truck. And within an instant, he had hit the little girl, and she died. And Stephen Curtis Chapman didn't realize that the very few years that he had with her were the only ones. And the number of times that he said he related, when it came to bath time, he was so tired. He didn't feel like playing with the bath toys with her. And he said, I so wish that I did not wish that time away. I wish I had grabbed that opportunity to spend those few minutes with my daughter, to be able to play with her in the bathtub. We have to be careful not to wish the time away. Secondly, moving on very, very quickly, and we're going to finish up on time here. Secondly, that truth deposits will yield dividends. Let's look at this, verses 17 through 19. It says this. The son had gone. He had spent all his money. He tried to hire himself out, but he said, I wish I had the food that these pigs ate. Then he says in verse 17, but he came to himself. He came to himself, and such an important thing. He came to himself and said, how many of my father's hired servants had bread enough to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and will say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you, no longer to be worthy to be called your son. Can you please make me like one of the hired servants? Now, here's what's important. I'm not so interested in what the son said. I'm interested in why the son was able to say that. I think the son was able to say that because the father deposited within the son's understanding truth that the father loved him regardless. Otherwise, that son wouldn't have said, listen, I got to go back and make things right with dad. If he knew that his dad couldn't care less about him, he would have said, what am I going to do now? I have nowhere to go. But he knew that he could go back home because for years, from the time he was little, I'm convinced that dad taught him by word, by action, by example, that he loved his son. And although the son made the decision that he did, he knew that there was always the option of going back home. And I think that is something that is not really brought out much in that particular passage. Because the spiritual truth was planted by his dad and grew when his heart got to the point that he knew that he was wrong. That spiritual seed then sprouted, and he realized that he had done wrong, that he needed to go back home and make things right with his dad. And here's the problem that we face. Number one, we don't know when that may happen. We know in the story now that the son, by the time he had spent all his money, had wasted all his funds that his father had given to him, however many weeks or months or days that may have been, but the father didn't know when that was going to happen. The father then also did not know how much of a changing of mind would have happened. He didn't know how much his son had taken on truth. He didn't know how much his son was listening. The father only knew that his responsibility was to be that example in word and action, and then trust God with those results. I'm sure the son said, you know what? Dad was not so stupid. If you take a moment to read the little bulletin, I love that little quote by Mark Twain, I think it is. He said from the time he was 17 through 21, he couldn't believe how much Dad had gained in knowledge and understanding. But then let's take a few minutes now just to take a look at this last little section, because this is what we want to spend just the last few minutes on, thinking about the heart of a godly father. The heart of a godly father. Let's read these verses again, verses 20 through 24, and then we're going to wind up for today. It says this. And he arose, the son arose, and came to his father. But notice what happens. But when he was still a great way off, even though the lad was still, I don't know how long a great way is, 100 meters, 200 meters, I don't know. When he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. Remember last week, we talked about what compassion was. You remember what we said maybe a good definition would be? Would be suffering with somebody. This father was suffering with his son. Even though he was not physically with him, his heart was broken. He was suffering with his son. Verse 21. Verse 20. And he ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight, and no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet, and bring the fatted calf here, and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For my son who was dead and is alive again, he is lost and is found. And they began to make merry. Here's a few things that I think are incredibly important here regarding the heart of this godly father. Number one, the father's eyes were looking for him. I can imagine every day that son was away. That father was there. If he had binoculars on at the day, he would have been having those binoculars out. They didn't have those. I'm sure he was at that window looking for his son every day. Had he not been looking, he wouldn't have seen his son, as he was still far off. But the father was looking for his son. He surrendered him over to God. And he was looking for God to bring him home. Now, giving our children over to God, which is incredibly important, also means that we need to release them over to God. We can have such a tight grip on something. And there's a scriptural idea. And sometimes we bring this out on Mother's Day. I don't know why we do it on Father's Day as well. the scriptural idea, and there's an example in Psalm, if I remember right, that says that children are sort of compared to an arrow. And blessed is the man that has a quiver full of arrows. And the purpose of an arrow is to be released and shot. The purpose of an arrow isn't to stay in the quiver. The purpose of an arrow is to be shot. So our job as parents, our job as dads, is to be able to prepare our children to be released out into the world with as much skill and with as much tools to be ready to face all the rubbish that is out there in the world. And so as that father was looking for his son, surrendering him to God, he released him over to God, knowing what was going to happen and praying that God would bring back his son. But then, notice that, his father's heart was filled with compassion. He was filled with that love. He was filled with that suffering with him. To the point that when the son was on his way back, his father saw him, and then the father didn't wait for the son to come all the way to the house. He ran out to meet him, and he fell on his neck and he kissed him. You know what? There's all kinds of other responses that could have happened. He could have said, I told you so. He could have said that, but he didn't. He could have said, I told you so. He could have said, you know what? You made your choice. You chose not to be part of our family anymore. You chose to go off and do your own thing. So therefore, I don't love you because you don't deserve my love. He didn't do that. I'm convinced he said, I love you because you are my son. And that is his identity. You are my son. I love you. Now, we're not going to get into that next bit because the older son came back complaining. But the reality is there are consequences. The father told the older son, you're going to get your portion. But right now, what we need to be thankful about is that your younger brother has come back. He was dead, and now he's alive. And that's what we're going to celebrate. And last but not least, the Father's Spirit was quick to forgive. It's so easy to hold on to bitterness, unforgiveness for what we think maybe as parents or as dads that our children owe us. But if we can learn to forgive, there is healing, there's strength, there's release and forgiveness. Now, I'm not saying that we should be walked all over. Okay? We've talked a lot about forgiveness in the past, and we need to come to this again. I've got a little film clip that I want to show you right at the end. It's just a couple minutes long. It's from a film called Unbroken. Unbroken. It's a true story about a young chap who was a prisoner of war in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. And you can actually see it on Netflix. Chase, you know what it is on Netflix? Okay, you can see it on if you're a Netflix person, it's on Netflix. And it goes through the entire story, the entire event of his life, and he was actually in the world of coming up to the Olympics. He was a runner. He was going to be in the Tokyo Olympics, oddly enough. And he just had that ability, but he had either was drafted or joined the military, and it was captured. And it went through years in that Japanese prisoner of war camp, and was treated with unbelievable cruelty. And in particular by this one captain, this one leader who had beaten him to no end and had made an example of him. and actually shown that he had gone from one camp to another, and this leader was actually at the same camp again. And this young chappie couldn't believe that this particular one was there with him again. But the one who experienced this, now we're going to see just a brief little testimony about him, about the power of forgiveness. For all the dads, and for those who are out here, that we need to consider this thing of forgiveness. Let's realize that there is great power in forgiveness as we think about this thing of the Father's heart, how that this dad undoubtedly had forgiven his son, had welcomed him back with loving arms.